Now that we're a couple weeks into the life of the Switch 2, I think it's fair to say that the old Switch tax is officially back, and I actually think it might be worse than ever. What's up, guys? My name is Evan, and this is kind of just me ranting about my thoughts on something I've noticed about the Switch 2 in the early days. Maybe it's kind of flown under the radar because everyone's just excited about the new system. Maybe you haven't noticed that the Switch tax is back, but I argue that it's back, and it's back with a vengeance. But to understand why the Switch tax is so bad right now, it's important to understand how it began all the way back on the Switch 1 in 2017. Don't worry, I'm not gonna give you a whole history lesson here. Okay, maybe a little bit, but trust me. And just one quick note before I get into it. Everything that I'm gonna reference here in terms of pricing and whatnot is gonna be physical releases. As you can probably tell, I like to hold my games, I like to collect my games, so this experience for me has all been at retail stores and whatnot. You can make fair arguments on both sides whether or not there is a Switch tax for digital games on eShop, but I'm keeping it strictly physical with this one. So what is the Switch tax exactly? I guess I should explain it. In short, games on the Switch just tend to be a little bit more expensive versus PlayStation or Xbox, and it seems like the reason why is just kind of because they're on Switch and they can get away with it. Games, especially those from third parties, just tended to be a bit more expensive on Nintendo's little handheld that could. Just take a look at Rockstar's LA Noire remaster, a fantastic game by the way, but it launched day and day with the other consoles on Switch, and it was $39.99 on PS4 and Xbox, but that Switch version was $49.99, $10 more, and we didn't really get a reason why. The same thing happened with Yooka-Laylee in the Impossible Layer. That Switch version, $10 more. Pony up. Bethesda's port of Skyrim to the Switch was a pretty big release. It was in all of the pre-release trailers. Nintendo was hyping this one up, and it hit shelves at $59.99, full price. And this price really never changed. While other versions went on sale, this Switch version stayed put. There's a few more examples I could probably list off, but I think you're getting the gist. But in my opinion, the Switch tax wasn't just about a higher price, but a lower value for a lot of games that came out on Switch. You see, it wasn't uncommon for a lot of Switch ports to retail at the same price as their PlayStation or Xbox counterparts. As you'd expect, a lot of Switch versions compared to those were inferior. They provided less content and less value than you would get on other platforms. And since the Switch lasted for so long, we got to see this happen through two generations of competition. At the beginning of the Switch's life, it was games like WWE 2K18 or The Outer Worlds, where we saw just poor performance that didn't really stack up to the other versions, and you couldn't really justify paying $60 for those. Give it a couple years and we started seeing stuff like Mortal Kombat 1 and Hogwarts Legacy, which I guess were valiant attempts to make those games run on way lesser hardware, but the results kind of speak for themselves. They were not ideal. I guess credit for trying to push the envelope, but charging $60 for Hogwarts Legacy when it looked like this was not really ideal for anybody. And it was even worse with Mortal Kombat 1. They charged $70 for that and $110 for a deluxe edition for a game that looked like this. I mean, it was like mush and floating heads and textures. It was ugly. It was horrible. Everything was awful. You know, even some good ports were just lesser on Switch. We just kind of overlooked them. Just take Doom 2016. I mean, that game had a pretty advanced level editor on the other consoles, but it just was missing on Switch. But nobody really noticed because it had multiplayer, and at least it had the multiplayer. Now, I get why it wasn't there. I really do. The Switch definitely couldn't handle that level editor. Makes a lot of sense here. But because they charge full price for it, my point still stands. It is a lesser value compared to the other versions of the game. And again, this was mostly the fault of third parties, or it was mostly coming from third parties. Nintendo was off doing their own little thing in the corner. You know, they released bangers throughout the Switch generation, we all know that. But every once in a while, they came out with a port of a 3DS game or a Wii game or a Game Boy game, and they wanted to charge more for it now than they did back then. Hope you didn't notice, I guess. And real quickly, guys, if you are enjoying this video, hit that like button. And if you like gaming, collecting content, discussions just like this, rants, or if you just want to hear more of my voice for some reason, hit subscribe if you haven't already. And let's talk a little bit more about why the Switch tax was a thing. It was a pretty hot topic during the Switch's early years, I think, but as time went on, the discussion kind of died down. People came up with their own justifications for why it was going on, and we all just kind of went with it. You see, Switch cartridges have to be ordered right from Nintendo, and they cost more than your average Blu-ray or even your Ultra Blu-ray when the PS5 and Xbox came out. Yeah, Switch cartridges were still more expensive to produce, especially when you factor in the size of the cartridge that a developer or publisher might have needed. There's a reason only so many games used that 32GB cartridge. Ports like Doom Eternal barely survived. This one needed limited run to step in because the physical release was canceled for many reasons, but one of them undoubtedly was the cost to manufacture this. There just wasn't enough profit on the table for it to be a viable release. There was also something else that happened in 2020, but yeah, I'm gonna blame the cartridge size. At least during the Switch's life, there was a decently reasonable explanation for why games were slightly more expensive. So it's at least plausible to understand why we had the Switch tax in the first place. And if you agree with that financial argument, yeah, that's perfectly fair, 100% justifiable. However, that same reasoning is why this 2025 version of the Switch tax 2.0 just feels so much worse. It just stings a little bit more. Don't get me wrong, the discussion around Switch 2 games and pricing has been never-ending, and I am certainly not helping with this video. But at least during the Switch 1's life, it was decently easy to justify the Switch tax. Like I just said, those cartridges are more expensive. But now, with the Switch 2, we have these game key cards. If you thought this is where I'm going, you were exactly right. You see, this game cartridge doesn't have anything on it. It's basically empty. There's only enough data to exchange a digital handshake with the eShop, and you get to download the game in full. You probably knew that already. In short, games are being purposely devalued, and companies are just expecting us to pay more for them. Let's talk about a game like Hogwarts Legacy. You can get this on PS5 for like $30 new, and if you go on eBay or go secondhand, it's typically going to be like $20, not even. It's pretty cheap. But this Switch 2 release is $60, full price, and there's nothing new here, nothing added. And it's a game key. It's not like they're selling us this super premium high capacity cartridge where we can truly be able to take Hogwarts wherever we go. But no, this cartridge is pretty much empty. And it's almost certainly the cheapest physical option that Nintendo is offering that's not a code in a box. The same thing goes for Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's $49.99 for the Switch 2 version, just like every other version was at launch. And again, it's a game key. Full download required. But unlike Hogwarts, there's no path to turn your Switch 1 version into a Switch 2 version, which is especially annoying because that was complete on cart. But hold on to that for just 1 second. At least Cyberpunk 2077 doesn't exactly fit into this mold for the Switch tax 2.0. Sure, they charge $10 more than the other versions for it, but at least they shelled out for that 64GB card and everything's on it. So CD Projekt Red gets a pass here. And it's even impacting games that aren't out yet. Just take a look at Trails Beyond the Horizon, a game that's not scheduled to ship until 2026. The Switch 1 version of that game is complete on cart. You could play it until the cartridge turns to dust. The Switch 2 version is $10 more, and it's a game key. Of course it is. Truly, us gamers, us Nintendo fans are getting the worst of both worlds with this. Higher price games and lower value cartridges, lower value releases. To me, that's the Switch tax 2.0. And sidebar, Nintendo's just kind of doing their own thing again. Remember, they're off in the corner. Sometimes they release games at $80. Sometimes they release them at $70. And they don't really tell us exactly why they price one thing $10 more than the other. But okay, whatever. So what's the cause of this Switch tax 2.0? I think there's two factors at play here, and one is way more simple than the other. Number one, companies just want to make more money. Of course they do.
Of course!
They don't want to pay for cartridges to cut into their bottom line and result in less profit. Very simple here, unfortunate fact of life, but this is just how business operates. But in my eyes, the root cause of this issue isn't third-party greed, it's actually Nintendo. We need to hold them a little bit accountable. Nintendo offered a wide range of cartridges when it came to the Switch 1. I believe they were from 2GB to 32GB, and you can get a bunch of different options in between. If you needed 4 gigs, I had that 8, 16, the whole spectrum. It was all there. The bigger the cartridge, the more expensive it was to print your game on it. So that's why we saw some games, Eleanor included, kind of have some data on the cartridge. You needed to download the rest, but it was something we haven't seen at the, I guess, volume that we're seeing right now with the Switch 2 and the game keys. But with the Switch 2, Nintendo is only allegedly offering one cartridge option, 64GB or a game key. So for publishers, Nintendo is basically forcing their hand. Either shell out for this premium, most expensive option, or go the game key route. They didn't have the breadth of options they had before, and it's just so frustrating to see because the impact of this is just plainly obvious because Nintendo still offers a wide range of Switch 1 cartridges like I just outlined. So let's take a look at one game that's about to come out, and that's Dragon Quest 1+2 HD 2D. You see, Dragon Quest 3 HD 2D released on Switch completely on the cartridge. That game was about 7 gigabytes large, so it's fair to say that the game was printed on an 8 gigabyte Switch cartridge. Maybe they had to go up a little bit more, but I'm going to stick with that 8 gigabyte assumption. By that logic, it's also reasonable to think that Dragon Quest 1+2 will be around the same size. And what do you know? The Switch 1 version is complete on cartridge, as you'd expect, but the Switch 2 version, well, that's a game key. And it's not just Dragon Quest or Square Enix. We're seeing this all across the board. Switch 1 versions complete, Switch 2 versions game key. Final Fantasy Tactics: The Evilslaw Chronicles, Sonic X Shadow Generations, Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, Raido Remastered, Trails Beyond the Horizon, Suikoden 1+2, No Sleep for Kaname Date, and we all know that damn Bravely Default Remaster, if it had a Switch 1 release, that would be complete on cartridge. Hopefully, Nintendo will start listening to us fans and understand that we don't want these game key releases. Hopefully in the future, they will start offering more choices to their third-party publishing partners, but we can only wait and see until that happens. Until then, we're going to be stuck with this Switch Tax 2.0 where we keep getting releases that aren't on the cartridge. They're inherently less valuable, and still we're expected to pay more for them just because they're on Nintendo's new hardware. We've already been hearing reports that Switch 2 game sales, from third parties especially, just haven't been hitting sales goals. I believe the quote was below our lowest expectation. At some point, you need to make a change, right? But for the meantime, yes, I do think we are kind of stuck with Switch Tax 2.0, and it really blows, but it's just the life that we live in, I guess. So with that, I want to ask you guys, do you agree with me? Do you think there is a new Switch Tax 2.0? Or do you think this is just the changing of the times? Do you think this is just how it's going to be? And also let me know, are you buying game key cards? Leave me a comment. Let's start a discussion. I want to talk about it with you guys. But with that, my name is Evan. Thank you guys. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe if you have not already. And I will see you in the next one.